today's webinar is presented by John Raymond from the Institute of Executive Coaching. John has been involved in coaching since it began to take hold in the Australasian region in the mid-1990s, and he's passionate about the professionalisation of the industry. His experience is firmly grounded in leadership, having led business units, teams and organisations. So before we get started, we're just going to launch a quick poll to see how familiar you actually are with webinars. So once this pops up, I'll need you to actually answer either A or B, which best describes your situation at the moment, just to let us know, have you taken part in a webinar before? And this will help us in guiding the presentation to suit you. And I can see those responses coming through, and they seem quite equal, which is good. But I can see that probably the majority of people are actually saying yes, they have. So I'll close that poll and share those results. And there we go. And a few non-responders in there as well. So, great. Excellent. And we're just going to launch another poll as well. So this poll, which will come up in a moment, is actually more about yourself. So what role do you play in developing leaders within your organisation? So there we go. Do you support it within a HR or learning capacity? Are you a leader developing my reports? Do you formally train and educate leaders? Are you a developing leader? And if you have any other comments, feel free to type this in the messages box in the bottom right corner. And we'll just wait for those to come through for another second or two. Great. And then we'll close that poll and share those results. And that will also give our presenter a better indication of who we're actually speaking to today. And as we can see, there's an overwhelming response for B. I am a leader developing my reports. So thank you for your participation in that, guys. We'll now hand over to our presenter for today, John Raymond.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Welcome to the webinar. I guess part of the drive of starting to look at the leaders developing leaders concept, not that it's anything new, but there's certainly a need to empower current leaders to bring on the next generation of leaders. The Australian Public Service 2011 Leadership Strategy, as you can see on your screen at the moment, came up with three kind of areas that are challenges or results from their research. Obviously, the first one, future leaders will have a different capability profile. And I guess if you think about the increasing degree of complexity, certainly in the government sector where you've got cross-departmental and cross-policy activities happening, that the landscape of where leaders will need to operate in is certainly changing. The second one there is that leadership development needs to be improved. And that's not just about how you develop a leader as such, but it's also the environment and I guess the policies and infrastructure that sits around them. Things like succession planning and talent management as well. And the third point, which is really the point that I want to focus on today, is that talent must be built from within. And certainly with an ageing workforce and in the public sector, I think it's something like 50% of the APS leadership will retire within the next 5 to 10 years. I also saw another statistic put out by an organisation that said that, saying almost the opposite, that a lot of people are now staying in work longer. And so we actually have a gift of experience and talent and wisdom and knowledge because these people are staying at work longer for whatever circumstances that we can draw down on. And that's essentially what one of the opportunities, I guess, of the leaders developing leaders. But if we have a look at the 70-20-10, there we go. If we have a look at the 70-20-10, there we go. The results, and for those of you that are familiar with the APS leadership strategy, you'll see this is a key part of it. But in all the work that I do across government and corporate, the work that Lombardo and Ike Kendra have done around this learning principle is pretty widespread. What they say that for someone to learn in the workplace, essentially 10% of it is formal learning. And that's really like the classroom. It could be an e-learning module. It could be something like a webinar. It could be going to a university course, going to a lecture, or reading a book. But it's some kind of formal learning. But that's only 10% of what they learn. The 20% are the conversations that occur in and around that learning, which leads to the 70% of on-the-job tasks. So if we look at the last two pieces, that means that 90% of learning actually occurs on the job. And this is primarily the responsibility of the current leadership cohort. So for those of you who are leaders and wanting to develop your team, 90% of what they learn around leadership, they will learn mostly from you and the people around you. For those of you that are in charge of L&D or in an HR role, empowering and getting the current leadership cohort to take on this responsibility of developing the next generation of leaders must be one of your key tasks. So the learning conversations is really where I want to focus today. And so I'm not discounting the need for the 10% of the formal learning, and certainly not discounting the need for the 70%, which is on-the-job training, where I actually sort of the rubber hits the road and I actually get to do whatever it is that I need to do. So in a leadership context, it's actually people being able to have opportunities to take a leadership role in some shape or form, whatever that might be. But where I want to focus today is on the learning conversation. And there's three components of this that I'd like to bring to the table. And there are certainly many more components to learning conversations, but given that we've got an hour together, and I'm sure you don't want to hear me talking about it all the time, but actually keen to hear your views as well, we'll just stick to three. So the first one is around relationships. The relationships, the strength of the relationship is the glue that holds the conversation together. If the relationships are not strong, if the relationships are not solid, then very little learning will occur. So I want to explore this because I think it's something that we tend not to focus on. We either presume that the relationships are fine, or we hope that the relationship will be strong enough to carry the learning. But there's some key elements in relationships that I think are worth reflecting on. The second element of learning conversations is the leadership framework that you are coming from. Now, the APS obviously has a very strong leadership framework, and we'll actually look at that in a little bit more detail about what actually came out last year in the 2011 strategy, because it has been updated on previous years. But regardless of where you're operating and whether it's public or private sector, understanding the leadership framework that you are getting people to embrace, to engage in, to learn about, is actually really key. And we'll look at both the formal leadership framework, which is obviously something that organisations kind of have and you can see, but there's also the informal framework, which is you as a leader, what you bring. So if the relationships are the glue that holds the conversation together, the leadership framework informs the content of the conversation. And the last area, of course, is how do we have the conversations? And I want to explore a number of different types of learning conversations and look at a number of different elements on how they're similar and how they're different, and what are some of the key tips that you can take away in order to have better quality learning conversations. So let's start with relationships. Now, as you can see, as much as this is not a work environment, or it might be a Christmas party, I don't know. It's actually my sister and her husband and daughter in Christmas time in Cambodia. But the strength of relationships that the leader and the person that they're developing, or the leader and their team have, is absolutely essential. And that's not saying that you need to be kind of best buddies and, very chummy and, kind of love each other to death. But absolutely there are some key elements that need to be there. Now, the first one that I wanted to explore is trust. Trust in the relationship is an absolute must. And I mean, I'm not telling you anything new here at all. I mean, everyone acknowledges that trust is a key element to for a strong relationship. But I think in the way that we work, and given all of us are kind of working and doing a lot of things, so there's a lot of tasks, there's a lot of stuff that's on our to-do list, that trust actually sits there and is not necessarily a focus, and we might not be kind of mindful of what we need to do in order to build trust. But trust comes in two forms. The first form is trust between people. So how do you build trust? And all of you know how to do it. All of you know when you're eroding trust. But the second part of trust, and particularly in terms of leaders developing leaders, is trust in the developmental process. So as someone who is going through a developmental or developing their leadership, can they trust that the developmental process that is supporting and scaffolding them is something that is going to work? And one of the best ways to do that, so for people developing leaders, or again for an HR or L&D person, understanding what the process is so that you can explain it, so that you can explore it, so that the person knows what the process is, so therefore they can have trust in what's going to come up. But one of the key things that people need to have trust in is the leader's intent to develop. And this is, from all the conversations that I've had around leaders developing leaders, this is actually one of the key things which I think is challenges leaders. A lot of the leaders that I talk to say, John, absolutely agree with you, but I don't have time. I'm so busy doing that I'd love to do this as well, but I just don't have time. Which is why I guess that the conversation and bringing developmental or learning into all the conversations is a must. But first and foremost, there must be an intention and a desire and a willingness to develop the next generation of leaders. So trust in that your leader has an intention to care and develop you is the next step. The third part that I want to explore is, for leaders to develop the next generation of leaders, they must be a role model. And that's not saying you've got to be perfect, but leaders need to be mindful of who and how they are, how they operate, how they interact, how they lead. And this awareness of self, which is the next point, but being able to role model the leadership qualities that you are hoping that the next generation will take on. In order to role model effectively, you need to have a degree of self-awareness. And so leaders in their everyday activity need to have an awareness of how they lead, what their strengths are, and importantly, what their weaknesses are. And this is, again, one of the key things that I see a lot of leaders really challenged with, simply because showing weaknesses and sharing weaknesses and being okay with both your strengths and weaknesses usually expresses a degree of vulnerability. But without that vulnerability, very little learning occurs. And so what you're role modeling is that we've all got strengths, we've all got weaknesses that we need to work within. Nobody's going to be perfect. So role modeling the fact that I know my strengths, I know my weaknesses, I work on my weaknesses, I'm not afraid to talk about my weaknesses, and I'm able to kind of step into that more vulnerable place, which then allows me to learn about how I'm going to deal with my areas of development. But a leader without self-awareness is usually a leader that doesn't lead particularly well. Now, the last area in relationships that I wanted to talk about was mutual responsibility. In any learning engagement, it really has to be a two-way street. So So, not only you as a leader need to take responsibility for the development, but the other person needs to take responsibility for their own development. And only when you've got that mutual responsibility does the relationship become a developmental or a learning relationship. So, what I'd like to do is ask you a question now, and I'd like to ask you, how do you support strong relationships? So, depending on your role, how do you support strong relationships with your direct reports, or how do you build strong relationships with your direct reports? Or if you're in HR or L&D, or if you're a trainer, what are some of the key things that you suggest, that you encourage in order to build strong relationships? And as we go on, please use the message box on the right-hand side of your screen. And actually, you'll see that Sarah's just written something down there. But you will learn as much from everyone else on the call and their experience as you will from me. So think about the elements of relationships. Think about the levels of trust. How do you build trust? How do you get leaders to invest and get excited about their intention to develop? How do you get leaders to be role models in the busy world that we live in? How do you support leaders and encourage them to become self-aware? And importantly, how do you make this kind of two-way relationship, this two-way responsibility starting to start to develop? It's interesting. So we've got Lynette. Thank you very much. We've got encouraging face-to-face. And it's interesting because in the current work environment, face-to-face is almost becoming less and less. One of the things that the research shows is that trust and strong relationships when it's face-to-face is very much about the spoken word, so the conversations that you have. If you're managing a virtual team, and again, you still need to have strong relationships with them, the written word is far more important. So often what we'll do with our virtual teams is that we'll actually just write a throwaway email, as we would if the person was sitting in the office next door that we see on a regular basis. But what you need to do as a leader is to actually take more time, because those words that you put into an email or some form of written communication actually carry more weight and actually represent more of who you are and how you show up as a leader. Any other comments or answers to that question? How do you support strong relationships?
We've got Dylan. So he said that he does so through identifying their individual strengths and encouraging them.
Very good. Absolutely. And again, what the research shows, there's a lot of research that's coming into the positive psychology field, and it's absolutely, you need to identify the strengths. But then how do you support the person to use those strengths in new and different ways? And when people are applying their strengths kind of in new ways across their workday, it has a positive impact on their well-being.
And Kelly also mentions that having an open door policy is important, and being open and honest and transparent in everything that you do.
Yeah, open and honesty. One of the key elements in having quality relationships is that there's a degree of openness and honesty in dealing with both the good stuff, but also with the issues and the challenging conversations. Interesting, with an open door policy though, a lot of leaders that I talk to go, well, I'm available, I've said I've got an open door policy, why don't people come and talk to me? As a leader, I see it's your responsibility to action that open door policy and make sure that you organise times, or you actually go to the people in your team to actually talk about how they're going, and specifically ask them questions to get them to engage, rather than just going, well, it's your responsibility, I've done my part in having an open door policy, now it's your turn to action that. And Christina, by demonstrating trust in them. I think one of the biggest things that in all the people that I work with, they talk about leaders that have had a big impact on them, and often they'll say that those leaders had more belief in me than I had in myself. And I think if you are demonstrating that trust in them, that kind of trust in them almost more than they have in themselves, they'll actually step up into that, and it certainly builds a strong relationship because you're giving them the opportunity. Okay, so let's move on to the next element in the learning conversations, which is the leadership framework. Now, this is a really key element to it, and we'll just wait for the slide to come up. So if the strength of the relationship is the glue that holds the conversation together, then the leadership framework is the thing that that kind of informs what the content of those conversations should be.
I'll bring that up.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's just on its way. And so what I'd like to do is to have a look at both the formal and the informal leadership frameworks. And I think when you're talking to leaders, or when you're thinking about you as a leader developing the next generation of leaders, understanding both the formal side, so what does your organisation have as a formal leadership framework? Now, the framework that I've put up here is part of the APS leadership development strategy that was released last year, as I've been talking about. And one of the key things that they added last year was the knowing piece. And so you'll see that you've got, you'll see that here you've got the knowing, doing, being continuum. What they added to the leadership framework last year was this element of knowing. You know, when the Centre for Strategic Leadership out of the APSC interviewed a lot of leaders across the APS, a lot of secretaries and DepSecs and SES, they said the thing that was missing from the framework was just the stuff that we need to know in order to be able to do our job. So they put this kind of knowing piece in here, and you've got knowing about people, knowing about business, knowing about the system, knowing about what it means to be professional. Now, the thing is that knowing piece is a really key element in a leadership development framework. Often where we focus, though, is just on the doing. So in the APS context, you've got the ILS, the Integrated Leadership System, which talks about competencies, and most organisations would have a competency framework. But leadership is much more than that. So it's not only the stuff that we need to know and the stuff that we need to do, but also who does a leader need to be in order to be effective. And so from the APS, they've got there's awareness of self, there's awareness of others, and awareness of situation around it. So this is just an example of a framework, and I know a lot of departments have their own leadership framework, and certainly most organisations have their own framework. But as leaders developing leaders, you need to know what the framework is so that you can have the conversations in an informed way about what is being expected from leaders in this particular organisation. I think that the being piece is often an element of leadership that people kind of feel a little bit hesitant about, simply because it's a little bit intangible, it's a little bit because it's internal, because it's unique, because it's quite personal. It's difficult to have conversations around. But even just asking people questions around, their motivation or their passions or their convictions, and I've got a list of questions which we'll finish up with today, which will give you a bit of a guide to look at that. But also around, what do you know about others? How does the dynamic, getting people to kind of look at the relationships, to look at that kind of social awareness piece, as well as obviously the situation. So in your leadership framework, I encourage you to look more broadly than just a competency framework. I encourage you to look at the knowing and the being, and really explore, I guess, a leadership framework that is kind of more complete than just what a leader needs to do. But the formal leadership framework is only half of the picture, and the other part of the picture is the informal side. So we've got the very wise and and wonderful Yoda here. Every leader has their own kind of unique informal leadership framework that they operate from. And for leaders to develop other leaders, they need to have an awareness of what their leadership framework is, what their personal or their informal leadership framework is, because that's the one that they'll be doing every day. That's the one that they'll be doing in the relationships, in the conversations of the day-to-day business. So asking questions, things like, what does leadership mean to you? What are the important characteristics about leadership? Or you can ask them to reflect on what's the best leader, or who's the best leader that you've had, or that you may currently still have. And what are the characteristics of that person that makes that leader so good for you? And what you're starting to do is to elicit their mental model, the way that they have constructed leadership in their mind, and therefore that informal leadership framework that they're coming from. As a leader, and as a leader who is developing other leaders, you need to be able to answer the following questions. Well, I think you do. The first question is to answer is to ask yourself, so what is the framework that you are coming from? And the formal framework, that's kind of given to you. You'll find that on the company website, on the intranet, or somewhere or other. But the informal framework takes a bit of time to kind of uncover and piece together, because normally it sits in the subconscious and you just act from it. But you want to bring that to the surface, and also ask the leader that you're developing what the framework is for them, what the informal framework is for them. The second question that I think is quite key, and this is just as important as the first, is the why question. Why do you choose this framework? What's the benefit of this framework? What is the evidence that supports this framework in this particular context, in this particular situation? And again, I think a lot of people tend not to reflect on the why question. We just kind of go ahead. But if I don't understand the why from a learning perspective, if I don't understand why I'm going to learn this framework, why I'm going to engage with this leadership framework and start to kind of embrace it and use it, if I can't answer the why, then there's very, very little hope that you'll actually take it on. So again, this is part of the conversation between you and the leader that you're developing. The third question that I think is really important is having a data bank of examples and stories that bring the framework to life, that bring the what and the why to life. So these are kind of your war stories as a leader. You'll be able to share examples and situations and times where this particular leadership piece of leadership either supported you or you saw it really, really useful. And this is the storytelling around it brings what is fairly conceptual from a framework, brings it into the human. It actually brings it and makes it quite kind of real and brings it alive for the person. And the last question, which I think most people ask, is going, yeah, John, this is all very, very good, but how do I do this? How do I develop the and help someone learn about the particular formal and informal leadership frameworks? And that's really where I want to go to next with the conversation. But before we do, I've got another question for you. So, thinking about the leadership framework, what leadership framework do you subscribe to? And I think the more challenging question is, why do you subscribe to that? So again, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on this, and not only the formal leadership framework. So, I mean, a lot of you attending today operate in the construct of the APS, but what's your informal leadership framework? Are you really clear about what that is? So I'd be keen to hear some responses in the leadership framework that you subscribe to, and importantly, why is that? What's the evidence that supports it, and whether that's your experience is the evidence, whether it's research that supports it, whatever the answer to the why might be. But being clear about that will certainly help you to be able to teach it, to be able to share it, and will certainly improve the uptake. So do we have any comments?
We'll just wait for people to type them in, yeah.
Okay.
I think they're typing away.
Typing away?
They're in webinar land.
Very good. Very good.
What are some common responses that you usually get to a question like this?
Do you know, people are often a bit stumped about it, which is maybe why we're not getting. And it's why I actually put this question in, and because most people don't have a very clear idea about the framework that they're operating from. As an executive coach who works in leadership, the guidelines for coaching in organisations that Standards Australia put out last year said that one of the key things that someone working in leadership needs to do is to be able to talk about the framework that they're coming from. And one of the key things that I think is an important piece in leadership are things like a leader needs to be able to set a vision and need to kind of engage people, and that's a pretty standard sort of response. But I think that the other one is around a leader needs to be able to create a positive environment. So they need to be able to create a culture where people feel positive, where people experience positive emotions, because that's going to generate a whole heap of positive things for productivity, for well-being. It'll improve relationships, all of that sort of stuff. Mindfulness, I think, is another one, and we're starting to see mindfulness come out as a key leadership, or key element to leadership. And if mindfulness is really about just being able to be aware of self and your environment around you. I think that the APS leadership framework is a great one. I think it's really solid. It's well thought through. It's tried and true. And there's a lot of detail to it. So certainly for people in the APS, I think that's one that they would come up with. My question would be is how well do you know that, and as well as what are the informal kind of leadership framework that you would the informal leadership framework that you're bringing that you maybe not necessarily too aware of.
Do you think we should go back to the actual framework slide so people can actually maybe talk to that? Because Karen has just said that authentic leadership framework is probably more so for her, and because she can be me, she can respect herself and others, and can learn and enable others, and it's a process, not a solution.
Exactly. Yeah, I think leadership is very much a kind of an emergent property of being in a leadership position, and like you say, which is more of a process than a solution or an outcome or an end of it. It also allows you to learn and grow and develop by being you and experiencing yourself in relationship with different people in different situations.
Great. Should we move on while other people are still thinking about that one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I hope that question kind of stumped you a little bit and has prompted you to actually explore that question just a little bit more. Because as a leader developing another leader, if you're unsure about the leadership framework, how is leadership constructed for you, both formally and informally, then it'll be very difficult to pass that on. And it'll be very difficult to allow the person that you're developing to come up with their leadership framework. So the last piece that I want wanted to look at specifically is around learning conversations. And to me, this is the guts of it. This is it, as the first slide indicated. It's all about the conversation. One of my very favourite researchers, a guy called Ralph Stacey, who works out of the University of Hertfordshire in the UK, and he's a director of the Centre for Complexity and Management over there. Anyway, one of the things that he talks about is that the quality of an organisation is determined by the quality of the conversations in that organisation. So for me, the conversation is absolutely at the core of leaders developing leaders. And you can see here that, you know, there's times where you need to provide support, there's times where you need to give advice, there's times where you need to guide, there's times where you need to challenge, there's times where you might need to argue, but all of those things are helping the person to learn and grow. Now, one of the things that I think is very important in learning conversations is to have a sense about not only what the subject of the learning conversation is. So if you go back to the leadership framework, but really getting a sense about the how. So how is this conversation helping you to learn? And again, this is one of those kind of tricky things where if people have a trust in you as an individual, how can they trust that the process, the learning process, is going to help them? And again, one of the ways that you can do that is to share the process. So if I were to talk about the learning conversation, coaching as a learning conversation, which of course it absolutely is, I would be saying, okay, so if we're going to be coaching on this particular element of leadership, and again informed from the framework, I'd be saying, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to be asking you questions. I want to challenge your thinking. I want to stretch your thinking. There'll be times where it might be a little bit uncomfortable, but the thing is that when it's uncomfortable, when you're kind of being pushed in that way, stretched in that way, that's where the learning occurs, and that's why I'm doing it. So a little kind of prelude like that helps them to understand the process of learning as much as the subject that they are learning. So I hope that makes sense to people, that the what and the how. Now, how I want to explore this is I'm going to ask for a bit of a leap of faith in your logic. There's some really great research that I found that some of you would have seen by two researchers, Lasada and Heafy, 2004. You've got the reference down the bottom there. But what I want to do is to look at, I guess, ultimately the high-performing team. Let me just quickly explain the research to start. These guys looked at about 60 teams across the Fortune 500 companies, and they measured three things which gave them whether a team was high, medium, or low performing. They looked at the contribution to the bottom line, so that's a kind of a productivity measure. They looked at client satisfaction, and they looked at an internal measure which was about the strength of the relationships and engagement and well-being of the people. And teams that were low on all of those were low, teams that were high on all of those were high, and those that were kind of a bit all over the place were medium. Now, the reason that I put this team up, I noticed that in your sign-on there was a few people that were looking at how can I better engage my team, but also I would say, and this is where the stretch I'm requesting your kind of jump of logic, is that for a high-performing team to be high-performing, I think there's a whole heap of learning conversations that need to go in there so that they're constantly adapting, they're constantly growing and developing, and that's part of the reason that they're a high-performing team. What Lasada and Heafy looked at were the types of conversations that these teams were having, and basically divided it into three elements. So you've got the other to self, so you'll see up here, and this is the ratio of, in the conversations, how much of the conversation was about the other person, how much of the conversation was about the self. And you can see that in a low-performing team, there was a huge bias to talking about me, and only every now and then would I actually talk about you. But if we go down to a high-performing team, you can see that this is about 50-50. I need to bring myself into the conversation. I need to share my experience. I need to set my expectations. I need to be able to, include myself in the conversation. But 50% of the time, I want the conversation to be about you. If we look at the second element here, just quickly, the ask versus tell. So again, in the low performing team, there's a lot more telling going on compared to asking questions. But if we move down to a high-performing team, you'll see that there's about a 50-50 ask to tell. And the last one here is positive comments to negative comments. And unsurprisingly, the low-performing team tend to be more negative than positive. But if we come down to the high-performing team, you'll see that it has a ratio of 5 positive to 1 negative. Now, why I wanted to put this up here was if we use this as a construct to look at a number of learning conversations, and let's kind of break those conversations down using the elements of other to self, so other to self, as well as ask versus tell and positive to negative, and just to see how they stack up. So what I've got here are some classic learning conversations. So mentoring, training, and feedback and coaching. So for mentoring, if we have a look at the mentoring conversation and kind of explore it in terms of these elements that Lusada and Heafy explored, so the other to self, the ask versus tell, and the positive to negative. And if mentoring is sharing my experience and kind of bringing my knowledge and my wisdom, and as leaders would need to do, given that they've been in the job longer, they understand the environment, mentoring is absolutely a key learning conversation. Now, classically, I would say that mentoring is a balance between other and self. So it's definitely me sharing my experience, but I really want to kind of engage with your experiences as well. But I think most mentoring conversations tend to focus more on self. So the mentor, let me share my experience, let me kind of go into more of a telling sort of phase to so that you'll absorb my experience. So I think even though a mentoring relationship or a mentoring conversation is meant to be more balanced in both the other to self and the ask to tell, it tends to be more self-focused and it tends to be more telling-focused. But overall, it has a positive impact. If we look at training, again, training is kind of classically more about self. I think the trainer kind of sharing and imparting their knowledge and skills. But again, like ideally, it probably wants to be balanced. If you look at a lot of the adult learning principles and the generative learning, it really needs to be in that kind of balance is the best form. And I think the ask versus tell, I think the telling is classically what training is about. If you think of kind of the lecture that very much that kind of expert, but certainly the best training, as you would have experienced yourself and probably delivered yourself, is a mixture between telling and asking. Yet, good training certainly has a positive impact. Now, if we look at feedback, feedback is definitely about self. It's my opinion. It's my perception, and I'm sharing that with you, what I think you should do. So it's very much about self, very much about telling. And what the neuroscience says is that even when you say the word feedback, it tends to generate a negative emotion and tends to have a negative impact. So I think it's one of the things that you've got to be a bit careful about. Coaching, on the other hand, is very much about the other person. Pure coaching, it's all about the other person. It's about their goal, it's about their solution, it's about what they are going to do. It's very much an asking approach, and so there's no real telling in a classic coaching conversation. And certainly the research that at the Institute we've found is that it is about 92-93% positive. So our research says that about 92% are absolutely satisfied with their coaching conversations. Now, for me, what's interesting here, if you look at the this table, you'll see that coaching is really the only conversation that is really about other, that is really about asking, and compared to the mentoring, training, and feedback. Now, if we think back to the previous slide, what Lusada and Heafy found that a high-performing team, it's about 50-50. 50 self, 50 other, 50 asking, 50 telling. And if you look at these conversations here, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, coaching's really only the one that sits on the other side purely and sits on the asking side, which for me then makes it actually far more important and far more critical to someone's learning in order to get that 50-50 balance. So, and I'll be very keen to hear your response to I guess my assessment and my analysis of these learning conversations and how I've divided them up. But what I wanted to do for the last few minutes is really to share some questions. And these are questions that I think any leader can bring that will start to develop both learning in conversations, and these are in any conversations that you can ask, as well as starting to build a bit of a learning culture. And there's three types of questions that I've identified. The first one are goal questions. If you want someone to develop, they need to know where they're developing to, and spending a reasonable amount of time getting clear about what their aspirations are, both personal and professional, I think is a really key element, because as much as we have a professional role, I don't leave the personal at home. And if you as a leader can support them in their personal aspirations, you're really kind of cementing and strengthening their commitment to both the organisation and certainly to you. But some of the other questions here. So what would you like to develop? What do you need to learn to develop that? Where do you see yourself in 2, 5 or 10 years? What would be an ideal outcome? And some of these real stretch ones. So what would be a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal for you? Getting people to think big, getting people to think kind of outrageously, getting people to dream, I think is one of the key things that you can get people to do. What is something that you want but you don't think that you can have? And again, like getting people to think slightly differently. And this last one, so what would be something outrageous? Again, getting people to kind of think big. So often we just kind of think rationally with what we can do rather than what we could do.
Can I just say for people out there who may be furiously writing all these down, we will be sending, for those who complete the exit survey, you will actually receive a copy of these presentation slides within 48 hours. So you can put the pens down if you like.
Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate that. I should have brought that up. The next lot of questions, and these are very, very powerful questions that get people to learn because it stretches their thinking to look at various perspectives. Now, one of the key elements of good leadership, I think, is to be able to have the capability to look at and embrace different perspectives. And if you think about yourself as a leader and the different leadership situations that you've been in, absolutely it's important to know your opinion, to know your perspective. But in order to lead well, you've got to see the world from other people's view. And that might be a customer, it might be a stakeholder, it might be your team, it might be the end user, it could be anyone's perspective, but a good leader will be able to see multiple perspectives. So asking perspective questions is kind of training that mental or cognitive capability to be able to see different perspectives. So some questions. How else could you think about this? What do you think I will tell you to do? Getting them to think from your perspective, and that's always an interesting one to hear the answer of that. If you were to look at this moment from 6 months down the track, what would you do? So getting a time perspective. What would your stakeholders say? So again, getting a different perspective there. Who and what else is relevant here? So getting them to explore what are the potential other perspectives that are relevant here that we can start to explore. And even like a simple question: what are other people saying? And if they don't know what they're saying, what do you think they're saying? Again, getting them to kind of think outside the way that they normally think. And the last lot of questions that I want to explore are option questions. I think one of the things the skills that we've lost in organisations today is the ability to put a number of options on the table. So often what we do is that, we come up with one solution, it seems like a good idea, it seems like it might work, so let's kind of explore that and off we go. But what I've found as a coach is that there's so much value in really eliciting and brainstorming a number of options. So this first question here, the what else question, and you see that I've written what else, and I'd even repeat it 5 or 6 times after that, I think is one of the most powerful questions that a leader can do to get the person that they're developing to really kind of think more thoroughly, to think more expansively. And, again, there's a degree of frustration, there's a degree of discomfort in this, because what you're doing is pushing through the boundaries of the thinking. And that's exactly what you need to be doing if you're developing the next generation of leaders. So a couple of other options questions. What are other possibilities for action? And again, kind of mixing up a perspective here. Think of a person, what would your mother suggest? What would the CEO suggest? What would Mahatma Gandhi suggest? What do you think I would suggest? What do you think your teammate would suggest? It doesn't really matter who the other person is. But again, it helps them to come up with multiple options, again, by coming from different perspectives. The outrageous thing, what is the most outrageous thing that you could do? Again, getting people to think differently. I love asking this outrageous question because people kind of look at me a bit strangely going, what are you talking about, sort of thing. But it gets people to think in a whole different way. And again, if you want people to learn, if you want people to develop, that's essentially what you're helping them to do, is to think in different ways. For leaders to develop, their cognitive capability needs to develop. That's essentially what will create a leader. And a couple of other ones. So what if there were no obstacles? What else could you do to approach this? The last little bit that I want to leave you with, which is my favourite picture of the whole presentation, is this guy's crazy, well, I guess it's a beard, isn't it? But to me, what it indicates is remember that learning and learning conversations are iterative, like his kind of beard is. It starts at his chin and sort of ends up at his ear. But the thing is that a conversation needs to grow over time. You need to have multiple conversations. You need to kind of allow the learning to develop over a period of time so that it is iterative. And if you can do that, whether it's with conversations, whether it's with the projects and things that they work on, but the commitment to someone's development is something that is required over a period of time. It's not an event. It's not something that happens kind of just every now and then. It's something that flows through the day. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's just about time, and there's a little bit of time for some questions or comments, particularly around the last one about the learning conversations. If you've got some comments.
Yeah, we did have some comments about the framework side of things.
Yeah? Oh, good.
We'll just go back and talk about.
Sure.
First from Lynette, and this is really relating to someone's environment within the organisation and how that affects it. So she says that she likes to empower her people, particularly in light of her current role within the APS, where strategic thinking is imperative in the current reform environment.
Mm. And again, so because that's a key competency area in the ILS, Lynette, to actually use that, to explore that, to look at the various behaviours at the various levels, gives you a really strong framework to kind of to guide the content of the conversation and where the expectations might be. Yeah, good point.
And Christina as well, she says that her framework comes from her work as an educational psychologist, and the qualities that are important when working with people so that they develop and make changes to suit them. And she's also mentioned that she's strongly influenced by leaders that she's admired, such as David Espen as an author, and the many leaders in the inclusion area of special education. Fantastic.
And I guess, Christina, what you've demonstrated there is both the formal sort of framework, which comes from your educational psychologist philosophies, but also the informal, the people that you find inspirational and the qualities that you like about them, and obviously their writings or their experience. And both of those are really, really important. So knowing those for yourself, but also encouraging the people that you're developing to really fully understand and explore what it is and how they can start to embrace those qualities.
Yep, absolutely. And as far as the questions, that's all that we have time for now, which has taken us up to the hour mark, which is perfect. On behalf of Redback Conferencing and also the IEC, I would like to thank you all for joining today. We hope you did get a lot of insight and inspiration out of the topic. I know I did. And like I said earlier, for those who want to see a webinar in action, we hope that it was a good experience for you. And like I said, this is the the first webinar in the Your Sector, Your Development series, so I'd like to personally thank John for kicking it off. Could have asked for a better presenter. And, you know, we hope to see you at future webinars. We think it's a great series and hopefully it will help you within your role within the public sector. So I'd now like to hand it over for John just for any closing comments that you might have.
No, I think I've probably said enough for today, but if you do want to get in touch, please give me a call if you've got any questions or comments. I mean, we do run a Developing Leaders program, and it's about how do you teach the current cohort of leaders to develop the next generation of exceptional leaders. So if you'd like to hear more about that, give me a call.
Great, and thank you all once again. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye for now.
Cheers.